They are ready to fight, yet in order to lead them, I must conquer the worm.
Take the kiss will make a hook of our siege, and ride as a leader of men.
With the release of Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Dune, I thought now would be a great time to take a look at the infamous 1984 adaptation by David Lynch, a film that nearly broke him. To say that earlier attempts to adapt Frank Herbert's gargantuan sci-fi epic were disastrous would be an understatement. From overambitious producers, unnecessary studio interference, catastrophic box office figures, and an extremely complex story that's difficult to condense into a theatrical cut, Dune has had a rocky road to the big screen. Released in 1965, Frank Herbert's incredible saga, spanning 6 novels, tells a sprawling story set in a feudal interstellar society in which various noble houses fight for control over the spice melange, a multi-purpose substance that can lengthen people's lifespans and enhance mental abilities, among other things. We go into it in greater detail in our video on Villeneuve's adaptation, links in the description. With that said, despite the density, it's a landmark series that received critical acclaim, a number of awards, and was hugely successful. But every time a franchise gets that big, film producers inevitably want to cash in and make a film adaptation. Between the book's success and the immense success of Star Wars in the 70s, the race for studios to create an adaptation began. David Lynch's film was not even close to being the first attempt to adapt Frank Herbert's story. The rights to the book changed hands multiple times over the course of a decade, before finally landing in the laps of Lynch and Universal Pictures. The first person to acquire the film rights was Planet of the Apes producer Arthur P. Jacobs, who obtained them in 1971. Unfortunately, before he ever had a chance to start production, Jacobs died of a heart attack while working on another film in 1973. From there, perhaps the most famous attempt to adapt it came from cult film director Alejandro Jodorowsky. The rights reverted in 1974, so a group of French film producers, led by Jean-Paul Gibbon, bought the rights with the intention of having Jodorowsky direct the film.
I have my script. I need to find the warriors. Every person who will work in this picture will be a spiritual warrior.
This was going to be an insane production. I mean, Jodorowsky had planned to sign on big names like Orson Welles, Salvador Dali, Pink Floyd, H.R. Geiger, and Mick Jagger. The director was a bit eccentric, so he called his dream team of collaborators spiritual warriors and wanted to make a film that was a messiah of sci-fi. Eventually, he burned through all of his funding, and financiers weren't interested in providing more money once he began sharing his plans to make the movie over 10 hours long. While that movie obviously was never released, now hidden away in the vault somewhere, the pre-production process actually inspired other films. Notably, much of the creative team that assembled for the project, like H.R. Geiger and Dan O'Bannon, eventually teamed up and used their ideas in 1979's Alien. Speaking of Alien, Ridley Scott was also signed on to direct the movie at one point. Once Star Wars opened to great success in 1977, producer Dino De Laurentiis, who acquired the rights to Dune in 1976, was eager to get a new sci-fi epic made. He brought in Ridley Scott in 1979 after the success of Alien, and the plan was to make something commercially friendly that could match George Lucas's film. But that too also never came to fruition, and at that point, the project seemed to be cursed. Finally, David Lynch is handed the keys in 1981. Interestingly enough, Lynch turned down the opportunity to direct The Return of the Jedi in order to direct Dune. Probably not a great move on his part in terms of career, but frankly, the world might not have been ready for a Lynchian Star Wars movie either. On paper, Lynch was a great choice to tackle it. By this point, he'd made the underground hit Eraserhead and the critically acclaimed The Elephant Man, where he showcased his penchant for the bizarre and surreal, making him a pretty good pick to direct a story that's filled with trippy dream sequences like this. And so, the production for the film we know today began. Instead of Mick Jagger, the film had Sting. Instead of a soundtrack by Pink Floyd, we had Toto. While it all wasn't quite as grand as the idea that Jodorowsky had, the film did have a pretty decent cast attached, with the likes of Kyle MacLachlan, Sir Patrick Stewart, Sean Young, Dean Stockwell, and Francesca Annis, among many more. Despite how poorly the adaptation was received, it was actually quite faithful to the source material, at least the original cut was.
Without change, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. The sleeper must awaken.
Lynch chose to include all of the stranger elements of the book so as to keep the spirit of the story intact. Notably, he keeps Paul's prophetic dreams and didn't balk at including more unsettling elements from the story, like the disturbing child Alia, who talks like a fully grown adult despite having the appearance of a toddler. It's really weird. There were a few changes to the story. The weirding ways are depicted much differently on screen. In the book, it's a type of hyper-sophisticated martial arts, but in the film, it takes on a far more magical and fantastical form.
Through sound and motion, you will be able to paralyze nerves, set fires, suffocate an enemy, or burst his organs.
The whole Fremen glowing eyes bit isn't entirely accurate either. The Fremen tribe do have intensely blue eyes in the book, but they don't have the bizarre glow that they do in Lynch's movie. Probably the most obvious change is with Baron Harkonnen's character, who doesn't have all of those monstrous spoils that he has in the movie.
We're knee deep in a Atreides blood! We've got them! We've got them!
He doesn't really fly like that in the books either. The ending where Paul actually performs an act of God and makes it rain on Arrakis also isn't present in the novel, something Herbert took issue with. For the most part though, it's a beat-for-beat retelling of the book. The problem is, films and books are two very different mediums. Books allow much greater insight into the thoughts of characters and can add nuance through literary devices. Film has to work a little harder to establish these things and has to create a world visually without dumping too much exposition on the viewers. In the case of Lynch's film, Virginia Madsen's character, Princess Zuralan, appears floating on screen to deliver explanations that help fill in the gaps.
Oh yes, I forgot to tell you. The spice exists on only one planet in the entire universe, Dune.
While that is how many of the chapters in Frank Herbert's story open, thus making it very accurate to the source material, it doesn't translate very well to the screen. It actually makes for an overwhelming start to the film, which ironically makes the movie even more difficult to follow. By post-production, things really started to go south. Universal Pictures was shocked to learn that Lynch had put together a nearly 3-hour film. Wanting a standard theatrical run of 2 hours, the studio forced Lynch, Dino De Laurentiis, and Rafaela De Laurentiis to cut out multiple scenes, add narration, include that exhausting introduction from Virginia Madsen, and to film more new scenes that were meant to explain the plot. Needless to say, the final product ended up being far from what Lynch originally envisioned. He was ultimately denied the opportunity to make his final cut of the film, and rumors say that he didn't even get to see the cut of the movie that was sent out for screen tests. According to an article from a Dune fan site, an unnamed crewmate said that Lynch was cutting out footage with tears still in his eyes. Thanks to the enormous cuts made to the film, the final result was borderline incomprehensible. There's no way you can chop out an hour of movie footage and expect it to flow well. Ultimately, one of the biggest complaints about the version that made it to theaters was that it made no sense to those who weren't already familiar with Herbert's book. Because of this, it received quite a few one-star reviews. The New York Times' Janet Maslin ripped it apart, calling it overloaded, and quipping that several of the characters are psychic, which puts them in the unique position of being able to understand what's going on in the movie. That's pretty salty. Meanwhile, Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel were equally harsh, calling the movie physically ugly and cheap looking, which sound more like your mama jokes than anything else to me, and emphasize how confusing the actual storyline was. Roger called it one of the most confusing screenplays of all time, and ended up listing it as the worst film of 1984 in their year-end roundup episode of At the Movies. In the end, the movie only made around $30 million against a $40 million budget. While there were plans to adapt other novels in the series, including Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, those sequels were immediately cancelled following the film's poor reception. David Lynch has completely distanced himself from the film. As mentioned, he didn't have a say on the final cut and was deeply dissatisfied with the end result. In fact, the extended release of the film doesn't even credit Lynch as the director. Instead, he'd replaced his name with Alan Smithy, a pseudonym used by filmmakers that wish to discern a film. Lynch even had a screenwriting credit replaced as Judas Booth in later releases as well, showing how he felt as though he'd been betrayed. The director generally avoids talking about the movie in all of his interviews, and has even turned down offers from the studios to do commentary tracks for special releases. It's actually a bit difficult to gather information about much of the filmmaking process because of this. Very recently, Universal offered Lynch an opportunity to create a director's cut of the film, but he said that he had no interest. Production illustrator and concept artist Ron Miller explained that once David handed over the final cut, he washed his hands of the entire project, being understandably disappointed and disgusted. There was one major plus for Lynch's career in the end though. It marks the first collaboration between Lynch and Kyle MacLachlan, who would go on to star in Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks. It wouldn't be fair to say that it was a total nightmare, but it was maybe 75% a nightmare, he said in the 2005 documentary, Great Directors. I had such a great time in Mexico City, the greatest crew. It was beautiful, but when you don't have final cut, total creative freedom, you stand to die the death, and die I did. Those wounds still haven't closed either. I always say Dune is a gigantic sadness in my life, Lynch said as recently as 2019. He also told The Hollywood Reporter that he has zero interest in seeing Denis Villeneuve's new adaptation. It's not that he has anything against Villeneuve or his ambitions, of course, but he stated that revisiting the franchise in any way would just rekindle his old heartaches regarding his production. Amusingly, Jodorowsky eventually went to see the 1984 movie. At first, he had no intention of going because he was still upset that his adaptation fell apart. Jodorowsky admired Lynch and was jealous. He feared that Lynch would do a better job than he ever could. In the documentary, Jodorowsky's Dune, he details how his sons took him to see Lynch's film, and he ended up leaving the theatre very happy. Not happy because he thought that the film was well done, happy because he realised that Lynch's film was a failure too, which is pretty salty, bro. Despite the messiness of the production and Lynch's own disapproval of the film, 1984's Dune still managed to win over many fans. At the time of release, prominent sci-fi author Harlan Ellison was one of the few people who had positive things to say about it. Ellison rightfully asserted that the majority of the film's problems came from studio higher-ups and were not the fault of Lynch. Frank Herbert himself has said that he had quibbles with some of the movie's characterizations, but was ultimately impressed with the visual effects and the accuracy of the dialogue. Contemporary critics ripped the film apart for being too confusing, but a later 2014 review from The Atlantic writes that Lynch and his surreal style were the right choice to create a world that feels utterly alien. All I have to say is, where were you 30 years ago, you jabronis? And while the special effects of the film were derided in the 80s, there are audiences today who find a kitschy charm in the way Paul's eyes glow and in the detailed practical set pieces. With all that being said, your opinion on David Lynch's Dune may vary. It's overwhelmingly dense and even Lynch himself isn't a fan, but the story of the production is certainly interesting, and it puts Villeneuve's efforts in a new light. The movie's production also reveals a lot about Hollywood. Last year's release of Zack Snyder's Justice League shows just how far a final cut can end up straying from the director's original vision due to budgetary constraints, plain bad luck, and studio intervention, and how close experiences like this can come to completely derailing a filmmaker's career. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, come join our regular streams on Twitch, and yeah, if you have any other suggestions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.